Have you heard of Stanley Hillis? His incredible life story is filled with war, crime, and a shocking murder. Join us as we learn all the unbelievable details about the rise, criminal reign, and brutal death of Stanley, the Old Man Hillis. His story is one you won't want to miss. Stanley Marshall Hillis was born on September 10, 1946, in The Hague, during a time when the city was still recovering from the Second World War. Just like many Dutch women, Stanley Marshall Hillis's mother, Adriana Boeks, fell in love with a Canadian soldier right after the war ended. When the liberators arrived, there was an instant connection between her and Stanley Marshall Hillis, Sr. He waved proudly from the tank, and despite the difficult times, people in The Hague were overjoyed. Stanley's father, a soldier, couldn't resist Adriana's charm. Their romance was short-lived, but lasted long enough for Adriana to become pregnant with Stanley Marshall Hillis Jr. The Canadian soldiers stayed in The Hague for a while to assist the locals and arrest the members of the NSB. However, eventually they wanted to return home, including Stanley Sr. But he didn't want to leave Adriana, who was pregnant with his child, so he asked her if she wanted to go with him to Canada. They didn't need much time to decide. The idea of starting a new life appealed to Adriana, but just before leaving, she began to doubt. Why did she have to leave with him? Why couldn't he stay in the Netherlands for her and their child? She gave him a tough choice. Either you stay here with us or you go back alone. Either way, we won't come with you. However, Stanley Sr. yearned for his homeland. With tears in her eyes, Adriana said goodbye. She knew she faced an uncertain future as a single mother. Perhaps, unintentionally, she sealed little Stan's fate with her decision, as she would be alone with the withdrawal of the Canadian troops. Adriana was just 20 when she had Stanley, and being a young mother was tough for her. Luckily, they could live with her strict and religious father in a modest neighborhood in The Hague. Adriana's father was very strict and religious, making life hard for Adriana and Stanley, especially since having a child out of wedlock was frowned upon in their community. Despite the challenges, Stanley received a lot of love from his mother in his early years. He was smart, but shy and stuttered, which made him feel insecure. Stanley missed having a father figure in his life to guide him. He often found himself in trouble and struggled to make friends due to his social awkwardness. As Stanley grew older, Adriana became stricter with him. During primary school, both Adriana and the teachers worked hard to discipline him. For instance, they used a note hanging around his neck to inform each other about his behavior each day, which usually wasn't good. Stanley felt humiliated by this, especially since he noticed that other children didn't have to do the same. He felt betrayed by his mother and the teachers, and he started to feel different from his classmates, who also began to exclude him. When Stanley was 3, his mother married her new boyfriend. In the first half, brothers and sisters follow in no time. The family didn't have much money, and things got even tighter as more kids came along. Sometimes Stan would sneak around the neighborhood to steal milk, porridge, and yogurt for his family, which the milkman left by people's doors. If he got caught, he'd be in trouble. Once, a police officer caught him and brought him home with a lot of fuss, Stan's first run-in with the law. In his busy family, Stan didn't get the attention or help he needed as a troubled kid. By the time he was 10, things at home had become too difficult and he was taken away. He went to a foster home, but he still couldn't stay out of trouble. Eventually, he ended up in a boarding school where he was very unhappy. As he got older, he became harder to control. He got into more trouble, and when he was 12, he committed his first crime, though he thought it was just an accident, but it had serious consequences. Dreaming of a better life, Stanley saved some money and hid it under his stepfather's house. When he decided to leave, he went to get his money but accidentally started a fire. He didn't realize what he'd done until later, when he was arrested. Stanley was accused of arson and had to go to juvenile detention for a few years. So, at 14, he found himself in prison for the first time at Het Poortje in Veenhuizen. At the age of 17, Stanley left Veenhuizen to return to his mother. She had remarried, but Stanley couldn't find his place in the family. Furthermore, he was still angry with Adriana because she had gotten rid of him while allowing his half-brothers and sisters to stay. That's why he sought refuge in shipping. Stanley loved boating. As a sailor, he roamed international waters in search of happiness and security. However, he couldn't find it at sea either. One evening, a colleague in Stanley's cabin starts talking about the French Foreign Legion. This elite group was appealing to young men back then because of the excitement, adventure, and chance for a fresh start. Stanley was especially drawn to the idea. As soon as he could, he signed up. The training camp in Aubagne, a village in the south of France, was very tough. with corporal punishment being common. Along with a diverse group of adventurers, he struggled through the training. After 3 weeks, they moved to Castelnaudary for another 16 weeks of intense training. Finally, Stanley and his comrades became fully fledged legionnaires, recognizable by their uniform in the colors of the French flag. However, it's unclear how long his military career lasted or where exactly he fought. In the early 1970s, Stanley left the French elite and sought refuge in Amsterdam. It was a turbulent time as drug issues started to escalate in the Netherlands, particularly in Amsterdam, where many illegal Chinese immigrants flooded in with suitcases full of heroin. This led to a booming heroin trade, controlled by notorious Chinese triads like 14K, Wu Li Quan, and Ah Kong, all vying for power and engaging in violent clashes. As the power struggle intensified between the last two triads, the situation in Amsterdam worsened. The once friendly atmosphere around the red light district changed drastically. Additionally, many Surinamese immigrants arrived in the city and were quickly recruited as dealers by the Chinese, leading to a surge in the heroin trade and addiction. The chaos reached a breaking point when the leader of 14K and his successor were killed. The police cracked down, expelling 1,500 Chinese, closing Eastern gambling houses, and shutting down cafes where dealing occurred. While the Chinese influence diminished, other groups, notably the Turks, stepped in to fill the gap. They began smuggling heroin from Afghanistan through Turkey, taking over much of the heroin trade. During that time, most Dutch criminals weren't interested in the drug trade. They were more focused on bank robberies. In the 1960s, bank security was lax, sometimes with vault doors left open during lunch breaks. Almost every week, there was a bank robbery somewhere in the Netherlands, usually on Fridays when cash was abundant. It was in this environment that Hillis entered the Dutch criminal scene, meeting some skilled bank robbers who introduced him to their world. Hillis proved to be exceptionally good at it. He was smart and paid attention to details, earning him the nickname the Old Man because he always preferred to sleep on decisions rather than rush into them. He quickly became the leader, organizing and masterminding robberies. Stan robbed banks with various associates, including Paul Molhoek from The Hague, and later with others like Yugoslav Slobodan Kostovski, Serbian Zeljko Raznatovic, and Frenchman Christian Brami Raznatovic, who later became a notorious militia leader during the Bosnian War, was particularly violent. Christian Brami, initially seen as less significant, became more intriguing when, in 1974, he was involved in the fatal shooting of an Amsterdam police officer. Brami had just escaped from a detention center, and upon his arrest on the Prinsengracht, he and an Italian companion opened fire on the officers. During the shootout, one officer died and the other was badly hurt. Along with Kostovski and Raznatovic, they go on a rampage across Europe. After years of chaos, the Amsterdam police finally arrested most of the group members. The chief officer reported that after locking up the majority of the group, crime in Amsterdam decreased by 60%. This shows how significant the group of robbers was at that time. However, Stanley wasn't someone to simply serve his sentence quietly. In 1984, he managed to escape from Huis van Bewering Schutterswij in Alkmaar without any tools or assistance. Prison guards and other inmates were amazed when they saw Stanley climb a 5-meter-high prison wall and drop himself down in no time. But that wasn't his most impressive prison escape. On January 23, 1985, Stanley escaped from the Bijlmerbuis, a prison in Amsterdam. The prison had a unique feature. It was partly surrounded by water. Weeks before his escape, Stanley started collecting items for it. He hid a rope and a hook in his cell, waiting for the right weather conditions. It was a typical cold Dutch winter, and he anticipated that the water surrounding the prison would freeze by the end of January. On January 23rd, Stanley believed the ice would be thick enough for him to stand on it. He seized the opportunity and threw his hook with the rope over the wall. After landing on the ground, he slid across the frozen water, ran past the metro station rails, and found a car with a roaring engine waiting for him. What followed after his escape was rather unexpected and likely unprecedented for a criminal. Still on the run in late January 1985, Stanley Hillis made the curious decision to sit down for a televised interview on Dutch national television. Disguised heavily with a wig, a fake oversized mustache, and large sunglasses, he conversed with talk show host Sonja Barend. The clandestine interview occurred in the dead of night at a concealed location. Stanley had a compelling reason for this unconventional move. He was deeply afraid of the police, fearing they might shoot him on sight. Motivated by journalist Jaap Jongbloed's portrayal of him as a gun-wielding, dangerous criminal, Stanley sought to challenge this narrative and present himself differently. He aimed to dispel the notion that he was a violent individual who resolved conflicts with firearms. Reflecting on it later, Stanley admitted that this interview was the gravest mistake of his life. While he had been relatively unknown to the public, the interview catapulted him to sudden fame in the Netherlands. Not long after the broadcast, Stanley found himself trapped in Amsterdam again. This time, the Ministry of Justice took precautions and locked him up in Scheveningen Penitentiary, specifically in the heavily guarded B1 wing alongside the most dangerous criminals. Despite this, he managed to escape, although the prison director kept this breakout a secret. This is where the story gets more interesting. In the late 1980s, Amsterdam's underworld was controlled by Klaas Bruinsma, the biggest crime boss in the Netherlands at the time. Stanley Hillis met Bruinsma through mutual friends and started working for him. Initially, Stanley wasn't involved in the drug trade, but after Bruinsma's death in 1991, it was inevitable. With a vacancy in the Dutch drug trade, Stanley Hillis, along with his friends John Femer and Mink stepped in to fill the void. They quickly became significant players, especially in the emerging XTC market, which had enormous potential, but also in other narcotic substances like hash and various dangerous firearms. It sounds strange, but during this period, the trio even received help from the police. At that time, the police and justice system were experimenting with so-called controlled transit to learn more about the drug trafficking of major criminal organizations. They facilitated a drug route, hoping to reach the top of the criminal organizations that had taken over after the death of Klaas Bruinsma. At that moment, the police did not yet know that Stanley, John, and Mink had taken over Klaas Bruinsma's role and were thus at the top of the drug trade. Stanley and his group could operate for a long time, while the police were slowly getting entangled in the so-called IRT affair. Various police departments were arguing with each other on how to battle organized crime in Amsterdam. The departments were not able to conclude on a unified approach quickly, so this allowed the criminals to build their empires in peace. From that moment on, Stanley Hillis became a prominent figure in the underworld. Around the year 2000, according to the Dutch Department of Justice, Stanley Hillis, along with Willem Halieder and Dino Sorel, formed a dangerous trio responsible for orchestrating multiple hits on significant figures in the Amsterdam underworld. Several notorious criminals were killed between 2000 and 2006, allegedly orchestrated by these three. Stanley Hillis was a cold, stern man who disliked being taken for a fool. Otherwise, you'd lose your head. If you got in his way, you wouldn't come out of it alive either. In the criminal underworld, it's said that Stanley made decisions that no one else dared to make, a true risk-taker. However, whether he was the mastermind behind these assassinations was never officially confirmed. Additionally, they were involved in extorting businessmen, a highly profitable venture, with Halieder particularly active in this. By 2011, Stanley was 64 years old, had made a fortune from drug and weapon trafficking, but nevertheless, he was always seeking new ventures. On February 21, 2011, Stanley Hillis was driving his Mitsubishi Pajero on Vizostraat in Amsterdam. 2 years prior, in 2009, police had confiscated Stanley's armored car after investigating his illicit gains. From then on, his everyday vehicle became an unarmored red Mitsubishi Pajero. Stanley had a noon appointment with his close friend Donald Groen. Despite the bustling Vizostraat, Stanley managed to find a parking spot when a car vacated. This spot happened to be next to a trailer marked with the company name Willemse Betonboringen Zandam. Sitting in the right side of his car due to its British configuration, Stanley parked. Soon after, a gray Volkswagen transporter parked behind him. A man emerged, approached the right side of Stanley's car, and opened fire without hesitation. The investigation later revealed at least 37 rounds were fired. In his unarmored car, Stanley had no chance against such firepower. Despite the daylight and busy street, the assailant took his time, even reloading and firing again. Afterwards, the shooter drove into a dead end, turned around, and fired at Stanley once more before fleeing. Interestingly, the trailer next to Stanley's car housed police detectives who were tasked with eavesdropping on Stanley's conversation with Donald Groen. A police helicopter monitored the area while undercover officers filled the Vizostraat and surrounding streets. Despite this extensive police presence, the shooter managed to escape. Police later claimed that one patrol car pursued the transporter but lost it. The officer allegedly didn't call for backup despite ample police in the area. The helicopter also lost sight of the transporter. The circumstances led to suspicions that the police allowed the assassination to occur, possibly due to Stanley's criminal status. Questions arose about how the shooter knew of the meeting. Stanley's lawyer denied any leaks, and Donald Groen, arrested at the scene, was not an informant. While Stanley was under heavy surveillance, it's plausible that police overheard the meeting and inadvertently tipped off the assailant. However, the head of the Dutch National Investigation Bureau denied police involvement, stating the operation did not merit praise, but refuting any connection to the murder. What are your thoughts on this story? Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you.